Look around you right now. The language you're reading, the financial system your money flows through, the legal frameworks governing your daily life, even the democratic ideals your nation claims to uphold. What if I told you that none of this happened by accident? What if every institution you take for granted was carefully architected by a power that supposedly vanished from the world stage decades ago? Today we're going to uncover the most successful deception in modern history. A story about an empire that convinced the entire world it had died, while quietly evolving into something far more sophisticated and infinitely more powerful than any territorial conquest could ever achieve. This isn't about conspiracy theories or shadowy cabals. This is about documented systems, traceable networks, and measurable influence that stretches from medieval Italian city-states to the boardrooms of modern multinational corporations. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the phrase, "the sun never sets," wasn't just imperial boasting. It was a promise that remains true to this day. But first, we need to travel back to a time when a small, unremarkable island sat on the periphery of European civilization, seemingly destined for historical irrelevance. 5 centuries ago, this damp patch of land housed barely 3 million souls. Compare that to the sprawling populations of China or India, each numbering in the hundreds of millions. The island possessed no remarkable natural resources, no vast silver mines like those that enrich Spain, no strategic position like Constantinople that controlled ancient trade routes. Yet somehow, this insignificant maritime outpost would grow to dominate a quarter of the planet's surface and control the destinies of over 400 million people. How does such a transformation occur? The answer lies not in the island itself, but in the networks of power that chose to make it their new headquarters. Picture Venice in its golden age. Not the tourist destination of today, but a maritime republic that commanded the Mediterranean like no power before or since. Protected by its lagoons from the constant warfare that plagued mainland Europe, Venice became the financial heart of the known world. 40 aristocratic families controlled trading networks that stretched from London to Constantinople, managing wealth that would make modern billionaires seem modest by comparison. These weren't just merchants, they were architects of financial innovation, creators of banking systems, masters of intelligence networks that spanned continents. They had perfected the art of indirect rule, controlling kingdoms through debt rather than conquest, shaping politics through economic pressure rather than military force. But by the 16th century, Venice faced an existential crisis. The great European powers had finally recognized the threat posed by this merchant republic and began coordinating against it. The old Mediterranean trade routes were being challenged by Atlantic exploration. Spain controlled the New World's silver. Portugal dominated the spice trade. The French and Austrians pressed from the north. Venice needed a new base of operations.
Enter England, a politically unstable backwater that most continental powers barely considered worth their attention, but the Venetian elite saw something others missed: geography. Positioned at the edge of the Atlantic, this island was perfectly placed to exploit the emerging oceanic trade networks. More importantly, it was far enough from European power centers to serve as an ideal sanctuary for capital and expertise fleeing the increasingly hostile Mediterranean. What happened next was the most successful case of institutional transfer in recorded history. Venetian financiers, merchants, and intellectuals began a systematic migration to England, bringing with them centuries of accumulated knowledge about banking, trade, and statecraft. They established educational institutions, founded financial houses, and began reshaping English society from within. This wasn't conquest in any traditional sense. This was transformation through transplantation. The Venetian system of governance, their financial innovations, their intelligence networks, their methods of indirect control, all of these were carefully adapted to English conditions and English institutions. Meanwhile, English society itself was undergoing a parallel transformation. The brutal civil wars of the 15th century had decimated the old feudal nobility, creating a power vacuum that would be filled by a new class of pragmatic, commercially minded landowners. These weren't refined aristocrats in the continental mold, they were essentially businessmen who had acquired titles, men obsessed with profit margins, and return on investment. When you combine this emerging commercial aristocracy with displaced Venetian expertise and a healthy dose of maritime adventurism, you create something unprecedented, a society that views the entire world as a business opportunity, where traditional notions of honor and chivalry give way to cold calculation and systematic exploitation, the result was the birth of what we might call predatory capitalism, a system that would perfect the art of wealth extraction on a global scale using a combination of legal frameworks, financial instruments, and when necessary, overwhelming force to bend entire continents to its will. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Traditional empires were limited by geography, by the need to physically occupy and administer territory. They could expand, but expansion brought costs. More soldiers, more administrators, more infrastructure. Eventually, the costs of maintaining an empire would exceed its benefits, leading to inevitable decline. The Anglo-Saxon system solved this problem by creating something entirely new, an empire based not on territory, but on systems. Financial systems that made other nations dependent on English capital, legal systems that protected English commercial interests worldwide, cultural systems that made English values seem universal and natural. This systemic approach meant that territorial control became optional. You could influence and extract wealth from regions without the expense of occupying them. You could shape the policies of foreign governments without the cost of administering them directly. You could access markets and resources worldwide without the burden of formal empire. The genius of this approach becomes clear when you realize that such a system could survive the loss of formal political control. When colonies inevitably demanded independence, the underlying systems of financial dependence, legal frameworks, and cultural influence could remain intact. The flag might come down, but the banks would keep operating, local governments might change, but the debt payments would continue flowing to London. This is why the story we're about to unfold isn't really about the rise and fall of the British Empire. It's about the evolution of a system of global control that has simply adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The methods have become more sophisticated, the networks more complex, but the fundamental logic remains unchanged. What we're witnessing today isn't the aftermath of empire, it's empire in its most refined form, operating through institutions and agreements rather than governors and garrisons, extracting value through financial instruments rather than tribute collectors, maintaining control through economic dependence rather than military occupation. In the next part of this investigation, we'll examine exactly how this transformation occurred, starting with the systematic adoption of piracy as state policy. The transformation from medieval backwater to global hegemon required more than just Venetian expertise and geographic advantage. It demanded a fundamental reimagining of how nations could acquire wealth and power. And here's where the story takes a darker turn, because the English solution was breathtakingly simple. If you can't compete fairly, don't compete fairly at all. State-sponsored piracy became the foundation of English expansion, not the romanticized piracy of Hollywood films, but systematic government-approved theft on an industrial scale. The Crown would issue letters of marque, essentially licenses to steal, authorizing private captains to raid Spanish treasure fleets and loot Catholic settlements throughout the Americas. Consider the scale of this operation. A single voyage by Francis Drake in the late 16th century netted enough gold and silver to pay off England's entire national debt. Queen Elizabeth herself took her cut directly from these piratical profits. This wasn't crime, it was economic policy. The stolen wealth funded naval expansion, financed wars against continental rivals, and provided the capital necessary to challenge established maritime powers. But theft alone couldn't build a sustainable empire. What the English developed was something far more sophisticated, a system that turned robbery into respectability, piracy into commerce, and exploitation into civilization. They pioneered the joint stock company, a legal innovation that allowed private investors to pool resources for massive undertakings while limiting their personal liability. The East India Company became the prototype for this new form of imperial organization. Technically a private trading corporation, it wielded governmental powers across vast territories. It could mint its own currency, maintain its own armies, negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, and administer justice according to its own laws. This was privatized empire, capitalism with cannons. Through the East India Company, England transformed the Indian subcontinent into the world's most efficient wealth extraction machine. The process was elegant in its brutality. Local rulers were forced into debt through a combination of military pressure and financial manipulation. When they couldn't repay, they surrendered territory and trading rights. Tax collection was militarized, with company soldiers ensuring that revenues flowed steadily back to London. The numbers are staggering when you calculate the true scope of this extraction. Over nearly 2 centuries, wealth equivalent to dozens of trillions in today's money was systematically drained from India to England. This wasn't trade in any meaningful sense, this was organized looting, backed by advanced military technology and sophisticated financial instruments. Meanwhile, similar patterns were being replicated across the globe. In China, British merchants discovered that the Chinese had little interest in European goods, but possessed vast quantities of silver, silk, and tea that European markets craved desperately. The solution was opium, produced in British-controlled territories and smuggled into China by the ton. When Chinese authorities attempted to halt this narcotics trade, Britain responded with overwhelming military force. The Opium Wars weren't fought over territory or honour, they were fought to maintain a drug-dealing operation that generated enormous profits for British merchants while devastating Chinese society. Victory brought not just access to Chinese markets, but control over strategic ports and the right to continue poisoning an entire civilization for commercial gain. Yet none of this would have been possible without the final piece of the puzzle, the creation of the Bank of England in 1694. This institution represented a revolutionary concept, the privatization of national currency creation. In exchange for lending money to the government, a group of private financiers received the exclusive right to issue paper money backed by government debt. This was financial alchemy of the highest order. The bank could create money from nothing, lend it to the government at interest, and then use government bonds as collateral to issue even more money. Wars could be funded indefinitely without raising taxes or depleting the treasury. Colonial expansion could proceed without regard to immediate costs. The empire had discovered how to finance itself through creative accounting. The psychological impact of this system was perhaps even more important than its practical benefits. Other European powers still thought in terms of gold and silver, tangible wealth that could be counted and stored. Britain had moved beyond physical money to something far more powerful, the manipulation of credit and confidence itself. This financial revolution coincided with another innovation that would prove equally transformative, the creation of global networks of influence that transcended national boundaries. Beginning in the early 18th century, London became the centre of a movement that combined intellectual discussion with practical power politics. Freemasonry emerged as the world's first truly international elite networking system. On the surface, it appeared to be nothing more than a gentleman's club devoted to philosophical speculation and charitable works. In reality, it became a discrete communication network linking politicians, military officers, financiers, and aristocrats across continents. The ideological framework these networks promoted was carefully crafted for maximum utility. Liberty, equality, and fraternity sounded wonderful in principle, but in practice they served as tools for destabilizing established orders that resisted British influence. Revolutionary movements from America to France to Russia found their leadership mysteriously filled with individuals connected to these London-centered networks. So there you have it. The greatest illusion in modern history wasn't magic, it was evolution. What we call the collapse of the British Empire was actually its metamorphosis into something far more sophisticated. The flags came down, but the financial networks remained. The governors departed, but the debt collectors stayed. The empire didn't die, it simply learned to operate without the burden of visibility. Today's global financial system, international law, and even the language you're thinking in right now are all products of this transformation. The sun never set on the British Empire because the British Empire never actually ended. It just convinced us all that it had. If you found yourself nodding along to this investigation, if these patterns suddenly made sense of things you've always suspected but could never quite articulate, then subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, because what we're doing here isn't just telling stories, we're decoding the operating system of global power. And if you're ready to see how the same invisible empire maintains its grip on Africa's richest nation, why Nigeria's vast oil wealth mysteriously flows northward while its people remain poor, then watch this video next. The truth is hiding in plain sight. The question is, are you ready to see it